Hi, it's Pastor Andy again, and glad you could join us today. We are now on June the 14th, and tomorrow the governor has lifted, it is said that he is lifting the restrictions, the COVID-19 restrictions. I guess we're never beyond COVID-19, but in this new world, we're not staying home, we're not doing different things, although it's still up to the local authorities. So my hope is that beginning probably in 2 weeks, the 28th, we will be back to meeting together at one time, all in full. We'll make that determination over the next few days. But we do still plan to bring these broadcasts to you. Hopefully by that time or soon after, we'll be fully live streaming as we do the service, whether that's just the sermon or the service itself remains to be seen. So again, I remind you, we do thank you for your continued gifts. They have sustained us and put us in pretty good position coming out of this time, but we have had some major expenses. We'd already planned on putting the roof on and stuff. So if you would like to give to the church, again, that can be done online at fairfaxmobaptistchurch.org and just click on give. And you can do that, or you can send a check, as many of you have been doing over these past several weeks and even months now, to Fairfax Baptist Church, P.O. Box 350, Fairfax, Missouri 64446. And if you do, again, if you put that to attention, financial secretary, that person will be the only one that opens those checks. So those are the announcements that we have for today. We're getting into to the meat of Romans now, and really this passage today, the theme of Romans 1, 16 and 17. And I would encourage you, if you have not been watching the daily videos that we're doing, I would encourage you to do that, especially this week. There is just so much. This could be an hour and a half sermon or longer. And so Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. And Wednesday's going to be a little technical, but I think it'll help clarify some of what Paul meant and help us to unpack and be ready to unpack the rest of Romans. So have you ever audited a course? Well, I did. In fact, it was my very first seminary course. I audited a course. It was a theology course at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And at the time, I felt like I was being called to seminary, actually being called to seminary before being called to ministry. And I just wasn't sure. And I talked with some people, and the church that we were at the time was going to be hosting a class one evening each week, I should say. And so I talked to Susan about it, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna try this out. And so I did. And if it wasn't for me, I was just out a little bit of time and a little bit of money. But as it turned out, it was for me. And not only did I get my master's, but now my doctorate, obviously. And now I teach. So the classroom is now very much a part of my life. But the problem is that I audited the course. But when I realized that it was what I was supposed to be doing, I still had to retake the course. I had to invest more time doing the same things, many of the same things I'd already done. It was with a different professor, so slightly different. Learning the same things that I'd already learned and spending more money that I had already spent. Now, perhaps you've taken a similar approach to this. Maybe it wasn't with a college class or something like that, but you dip your toes in the water. There's something that you're thinking about. You dip your toes in the water. You're trying to determine if this is something for you. And really, the approach is not a bad one. It's something that is very prevalent in our society today. But the problem is that many people do this with the Christian life. Let me audit it. If it works, then I'm going to stick with it. If not, well, no big deal. I can just walk away. But in reality, Christianity is all or nothing. There is no audit to the Christian faith. We are either born again or we are not born again. We are either a child of God or we are not a child of God. And if we are a child of God, then we must realize that this is serious. It is not a game. It is not something that we play with. It is not something that we toy with. It is not something that we just give or take. It is something that we must engage with seriously. Well, in today's passage, Paul makes this truth very evident both about himself and about those who claim to have faith in God. As we consider our theme for this series, Injustice for All, We must realize that true justice comes only from God, and auditing will not accomplish what we might hope could happen. God has already done the work. He has designed this life for full credit or no credit. An audit option does not exist. God has already done the work. He has already given the credit that can be earned. It is just up to us to claim it. He has made full credit available, as only He could do. But we have a choice in whether or not to accept that credit that He offers. So what does Paul believe about this gospel that we talked about last week, that he wanted to proclaim, that he wanted to preach? And can we simply audit the Christian faith? Should we do more? Well, let's look at this week's passage and find out what Paul has to say. Today's text contains 2 verses from Romans chapter 1, and these verses are known quite well, maybe not memorized, but most scholars believe that these 2 verses are the theme for Romans. In fact, these 2 verses represent the key to understanding Romans, and if you think about what a key does, it unlocks something. To get into the church, I have a set of keys that allow me to get into the church, but you know what the problem is that several keys on this key ring will not get me into the church. And I have another key ring that none of those keys will get me into the church. You have to have the right key for the right lock to get into the church. Well, a key does unlock something. And these 2 verses, and specifically the gospel itself, unlocks so much, as we are going to see. The gospel is the power to save first for the Jew and then to the Gentile. We find that in Romans 9 through 11. The need to live by faith is found in chapters 12 through 15, and the ability to live a righteous life and indeed to find that salvation that allows us to do so is found in Romans 1 through 11. So as I just mentioned, this is the key to understanding Romans. It covers 1 through 11, then 9 through 11, and 12 through 15, 16 being the exception. And yet, 16 addresses members of the church, both Jew and Gentile, to encourage them in their faith, which is the essence of the letter. So, again, these 2 verses are an outline for the letter. But even if these 2 verses are the key, that does not mean that they are completely straightforward. In fact, they are anything but straightforward. On the surface, they do appear to be, but verse 17 in particular is quite interesting and has perplexed theologians and commentators and translators for centuries, really since Paul wrote them, or at least since he died and could not interpret what he had written anymore. I'm going to cover those 2 verses briefly today, but then I'm going to elaborate on those verses, especially verse 17 in my videos this week, particularly on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. I'll talk a little bit more about salvation on Monday. But I want to just focus on the bigger picture of these 2 verses for today. So Paul begins, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Now next week I'm going to talk about the word "for," because we see it in verse 16, we see it in verse 17, we see it in verse 18, and oh, by the way, it's again in verse 26. And in between that, there's a "therefore." So Paul is continually building upon a logical argument. We talked about that some last week, and he started the whole thing off with, "First, I thank my God." So first he prayed. But here, first, Paul says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel." In the previous sentence, verse 15, he said, "I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome." He longs to go to Rome to preach the gospel. That was last week's message. In one sense, this notion should be very evident because Paul had been imprisoned. The notion, I should say, that he's not ashamed of the gospel should be evident because he's been in prison in Philippi. He stood up to a riot because of the gospel in Ephesus. He was chased from Thessalonica all the way to Athens because of the gospel, etc. But people are ashamed of the gospel. Jesus says as much in Mark chapter 8 when he said that he, meaning Jesus, would be ashamed of them if they were ashamed of him. You can see that in Mark 8, verses 34 through 38. Paul also writes about not being ashamed when he writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 and 12. He says this, and in both senses, the idea is that shame comes from fear of suffering and persecution. Last week in India, there was a 7th grade boy, Samudru Makami. He was killed by a group of Hindu radicals. The report was that he was killed by his throat being cut, his head being bashed by a rock, and then they cut his body into pieces. Why? Because he and his father, Unga, became Christians about 3 years ago, and this young man, Samaru, desired to be a pastor. Since that time, he said, I want to be a pastor, especially if something happens to our pastor. I want to step in for him. And this young man was always sharing the Bible with children in the village. In other words, this young man, boy, he was a teenager. He was a 7th grader. This boy was brutally murdered because of the gospel. Why would he risk his life? Why would Paul risk his life? Why should we risk hostility for the sake of the gospel? Well, Paul gives us an answer. And that is the next set of words. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, he says, for it is the power of God. It is the power of God for salvation, specifically to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. So because it says it is the power of God. What is the power of God? The gospel is the power of God. D.L. Moody once compared the gospel to a lion. He said, if somebody fully understands the gospel, all the preacher has to do is mention the gospel and just get out of the way, like opening the cage for a lion and just getting out of the way. The lion will do what it is supposed to do, what it is trained to do as a lion. The gospel will do what it is allowed to do, the power of God is allowed to do in the people's life. So the pastor just needs to present the gospel and then get out of the way. Well, again, to understand the gospel is thus to understand, or at least to unleash, the power of God. And that is the key for us. Again, going back to the keys. And I'm going to discuss salvation more in tomorrow's video. But before we are saved, everything is locked. We might think life is good. We might think life is grand. We could go along. But the gospel is the key that unlocks everything that God has for us. Now, please understand, God is still powerful, whether or not we are saved. God is still saving others by that power, whether or not we choose to believe or not. But the power of God that is mentioned here is the same power of God that has delivered salvation since the dawn of man. Rick is going to talk more about that in his video on Thursday. But it is not the power of the Roman Empire that saves, it is the power of God. It was the power of God that fueled Jesus' ministry. It is the power of God that brought Jesus back from the dead. It was the power of God that saved people in Paul's day, and it is that same power of that same God that makes salvation possible for you and I today. That power is the key that unlocks the door to every other key. See, this key opens the door that allows other keys to work. That is what the gospel does. And knowing God's power, Paul says with pride, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Well, we might turn that around. There's a literary term called litides that says we say things, but we really kind of mean something else. So one that's familiar for us, we might say something like, you're not going to be sorry for this. And what we really mean is you're going to be so thankful that you did this. Well, many people believe that Paul saying, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, is really about, I am confident in the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation. And see a little bit more about that in my Friday video this last week. I'm getting so confused with all these videos. I'm trying to keep them straight for you. But are we living in boldness? The boldness that Paul has, because that same power that was fueling Paul is the same power that can fuel us. If we believe in the one true God, we have that same power residing within us in the person of the Holy Spirit that was residing within Paul, that was empowering the ministry of Jesus. And as Paul wrote to Timothy from a Roman prison later in his life, many years later after he wrote to the Romans, he writes in 2 Timothy 1 verses 6 and 7, fan into the flame the gift of God, For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. So the gospel is the power for salvation. The gospel is the key. It opens up the lock that then opens up salvation. But the next thing it opens up is this idea, the righteousness of God in verse 17. And this is where we start to have some confusing understanding. I'll talk more about this in Tuesday's video. But he says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed. So with the power of God unlocked by the receipt of the gospel, we receive another key, the righteousness of God. Now, this righteousness amazingly is available both to the Jew and to the Gentile, and that's going to be unpacked further in Romans chapter 15. But for a Jew to say, wait a minute, the Gentiles get the same righteousness of God? We are God's chosen people. But amazingly, that was God's plan. It was God's plan all along for the Jews to be that light to the Gentiles. And again, Romans 15 makes that clear as Paul refers back to each section of the Old Testament to show the Israelites, show the Jews that was indeed God's intended plan. It was always meant for the Gentile. But notice the word revealed here. The righteousness of God is revealed. How? It's revealed by the gospel, which saves us due to the power of God. So once we have the key, that is the gospel, once we have the key of the gospel, then we can have salvation, which in turn reveals the righteousness of God. Now, personally, I believe that Paul means God's righteousness becomes evident to us and becomes evident within us. And this is a big debate. There's a lot of debate in here, and a lot of people are kind of coming to this conclusion that I draw from this same text, because both forms of this evidence are from God. It is not our righteousness that does anything. It is God's righteousness. We cannot become righteous on our own, and in fact, we would not even know what true righteousness is without the gospel being known to us. Again, I will speak more to that issue in Tuesday's video because it is a somewhat complicated issue. But once we know that the righteousness of God is revealed from God to us, there's no debate about that. The verb here is a passive verb from our perspective, meaning God is making this happen. Once that happens, notice then the verse continues, from faith for faith in the ESV, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So, we have the gospel, which is the power of God unto salvation, which then unlocks the righteousness of God, which then unlocks our ability to live by faith. This is a matter of faith. Through the power of God, the mystery of God's righteousness is revealed. Again, we would not know it apart from God revealing it to us. It becomes evident to us, which then allows God to transform us as well. His righteousness is evident to us, and his righteousness is becomes evident within us, and he begins to transform us. As we are transformed, you can jump ahead to Romans 8:29, uses the word conformed in that as well. We learn to live according to that righteousness that he is instilling within us. We learn to live by faith at this world. And even our own insignificant self is not all there is. Someone once said, and I don't know who it was, but apart from one very minor exception, everything that exists is not you. And yet so many of us go around thinking, oh, it's all about me. Oh, take care of my needs. Take care of me. One exception to all of creation for all of eternity is you. Everything else is not you. Everything is not about you. And yet, God sent his Son to die for each one of those minute exceptions. He sent his Son to die for you. He sent his Son to die for you. He sent his Son to die for each one of us, despite us being that exception. And once we take the key that unlocks that truth, once we begin to understand and receive the gospel, all of the rest of the locks begin to open as well, including the ability to live by faith within the righteousness of God. In John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. In other words, Jesus is the key. The gospel is not just good news. It is the good news. It is the good news about Jesus. We cannot pick the lock. We cannot break the lock. We cannot cut the lock. We cannot blast the lock. There is one key that will open that lock, and that key is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the life he came to live, the death he died for us, the resurrection through him that we can then attain, and our ascension following him into the eternal realms whenever that day is happened. One key exists, that he lived, that he died, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day for you and for me. So how do you live your life? Are you ignoring what God has made possible? Are you attempting to audit a 4-credit course? Life is a 4-credit course. You cannot audit it. It is pass, fail. It is all credit or no credit. And again, God has made that credit fully available to you. So have you committed to the one who made that credit possible based upon what he has already done? Our journey letter for today is O, for obey. The righteous shall live by faith, Paul writes. Again, that is a complicated statement. Check Wednesday's video for that. But if we just take it at face value, we can still understand it enough to live by it. So I would say, if the righteous shall live by faith, let us live in faith. Let us, in faith, live right. Live in obedience to the God that made our salvation possible by his power and by his love. Our next step this week is to live. We need to live unashamed like Paul lived unashamed. We need to live unashamed in God's power. We need to live unashamed by his righteousness. We need to live unashamed the life that he has called you and I to live. To live by faith simply means this: live in obedience. So this is my challenge to you this week. One thing. Do one thing that you know you should do. One thing that you've been putting off. One thing that you had this intention. On my videos over this COVID time, many of them talked about good intentions versus living with intentionality. Shake the intentions. Do something. Intentions die with us, and the world is not a better place because of good intentions. Intentionality is what changes the world and changes lives. So do one thing for one person this week. That's for you. You know what it is you've been putting off. You know what it is that you should have done. You know what it is that you're supposed to be doing. Do that this week. Live by faith. Let the transforming power of God, the righteousness of God, call you to do that this week. For us today here, we are going to practice our living by faith this week by partaking of the Lord's Supper. And so we're going to be doing that a little bit differently today. After I pray, we will give instructions. Father, thank you for the key. The key that is the gospel, the key that is our hope to everything, the key that unlocks everything else that you have available to us. The key, the gospel, that is the power of you for salvation, that brings about your righteousness within us, your righteousness for us, that enables us then to live by faith. God, as we prepare to partake of the Lord's Supper, we do so in faith. We do so in obedience. We do so in remembrance of the one who made all of this possible for us. And it's in his name that we pray. That beautiful name of Jesus. Amen.